Okay, welcome everyone to another random walk down Mill Street. Tonight's topic is Bendigamos. I see both my parents are on, which is very exciting for me because they're also babysitting my kids tonight. So that means that they're asleep. Good job. Okay. Um, so today's talk is about Bendigamos, which may be review for some of you. I see that Carla is on and others who may be familiar with this topic. But for some of you, and even for those who are familiar, I think there's going to be some extra material that you have not yet seen or encountered before. And that's what I hope to share with you this evening. Just without too much taking too much time away, how many of you know the song Bendigamos? You can raise your hand, you can put a thumbs up, you can put it in the messages. I think most of you who are here will probably have heard it before. I see a good number of hands up. And you've probably heard it here at Shereth Israel. I don't know if you've heard it in other contexts. Some of you, I don't know everybody here on this Zoom. So some of you may not know it from other recordings on the internet or maybe in your home communities. But Bendigamos is a pretty famous poem, piyut, song, which is in Spanish and is sung here at Shereth Israel after Birkat Hamazon, after the Grace After Meals, and traditionally it's sung on Sukkot. That's where we most frequently heard it when I was growing up in the Sukkah. Also special occasions at other times, synagogue gatherings of various sorts. But it wasn't always a regular occurrence. It was really more for special occasions. Nowadays, it's become so popular that in almost every time we have a synagogue dinner, we will sing Bendigamos. And so for a whole bunch of reasons, I wanted to talk about Bendigamos this Shabbat. I'm going to lay them out for you right now, and then we'll get started with my screen share. One is the melody. The melody of Bendigamos, for those of you who are familiar, is the same melody that we sing to Baruch Haba. Here at Shereth, Baruch Haba b'shem Adonai berachnuchem mibeit Adonai el Adonai vaya'er lanu. We're going to sing Bendigamos later also, but that's the same melody. But more importantly for this week, that's the same melody as the Song of Moses, Shirat Hayam. אז ישיר משה ובני ישראל את השירה הזאת לאדוני ויאמרו לאמור. That melody, which is a very ancient melody, is almost like a national anthem for Spanish and Portuguese Jews. It's the most well-known of our melodies, and it's one of the most identifiable Spanish and Portuguese melodies. And this Shabbat is Shabbat Parashat Bishalach, which is Shabbat Shirah. So this is the melody, this is the theme melody of this Shabbat. If you come to Shereth Israel this Shabbat, you will hear this melody. Yihigdal Elohim Chai v'yishtabach nimtza v'nedel metziuto. And we'll sing it in the morning. We won't sing it for the Shirah, but that's the whole. I think I gave a class about that another time a couple of years ago. And so that's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about Bendigamos this Shabbat. The other is because last Shabbat, Parashat Bo, we had a visitor in our synagogue, a friend of our congregation for many generations. Her name is Anita Tamari, and she lives in Israel, and she is the granddaughter of Reverend Joseph Korkos. We will speak later about Joseph Korkos, but Reverend Korkos was the Chazan of Shereth Israel from 1919 to 1922. Small 3-year period, but an important 3-year period when Dr. Mendes was essentially emeritus. He was in 1920, they made him emeritus. His health deteriorated in 1919, and he could no longer function regularly. He still spoke on occasion, but he needed to convalesce, and he went to warmer climates for much of the year. and so he was not functioning as their everyday rabbi, minister of the congregation. And Dr. Poole, who was the assistant minister, the associate minister, I forgot exactly what his title was at the time in 1918, worked during World War I for the Jewish Welfare Board and was a chaplain in the United States Army and went to Europe and went to Washington. And then as soon as the war was over, he was enlisted by the Balfour Commission and went to Palestine, and essentially was not in New York much from the end of World War I until his return in 1922. In fact, he takes a leave of absence in several requests in a row, 1918, 1919, 1920, when he is not serving the congregation as the assistant minister. And who is minding the shop? Who is the acting minister of Sheretz Israel in that period? Joseph Korkos. And why am I spending so much time on him right now? Because Joseph Korkos is the person who brings the song Bendigamos to our congregation. And it's from our congregation that this song has become famous throughout the world. It has a history, which we're going to talk about, but that's not what made it famous. What made it famous was its usage here in New York. And that is the story we're going to tell. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and get right into the rest of it. Let's hope that this works. Okay. I'm just trying to get a video panel so I can see you. Okay, here we are. Good. The title of tonight's talk is Bendigamos Revisited, Rediscovering the Roots of Our Beloved Ballad. I was trying to do some alliteration. It didn't come out so perfect with B's and R's. Well, that's what you get. I also want to thank our session sponsor, Rabbi Jeff Berger in London, who is sponsoring in memory of his father, Joseph Berger. I think the timing is such that he's going to have to watch the recording. I don't think he's watching it live. If I'm wrong, you can say hello to us in the chat. But thank you very much to our session sponsor. That's our title screen, Bendigamos Revisited, Discovering the Roots of Our Beloved Ballad. So when I was growing up, and even today, the birkon that we used was a De Sola Pool birkon, the Grace After Meals booklet that the synagogue printed. We're actually out of them at the present time, but most of the old timers have tons of these in their homes. And when you turn to the last page of the booklet, literally the inside cover, or the very last page of the booklet, is this poem, Bendigamos. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a song that is sung after Birkat Hamazon, and it is sung to the melody of Az Shir. And I think most of you know it, but we're going to hear Dr. Poole sing the first two stanzas, or the first stanza and the refrain. And that should remind you all of what the melody is if you weren't sure, or if you haven't heard it before, this will be your introduction.
Bendigamos al Altísimo, al Señor que nos crió. Démosle agradecimiento por los bienes que nos dio. Alabado sea su santo nombre, porque siempre nos ha apiadó. Loaba, Señor, que es bueno, que para siempre su merced.
And we could keep singing it. Bendigamos al Altísimo por su ley primeramente, que liga a nuestra raza con el cielo continuamente. That happens to be, that one is one of the more controversial stanzas in this poem. And it ends where we sing two times in a row, Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki le'en olam chasto. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki le'en olam chasto. And that is Bendigamos. We can talk a little bit about the translation a little later on, but essentially this is Grace After Meals in Spanish form, poetic Spanish form. A lot of wasted ink is talked about whether this is Ladino or Spanish or archaic Spanish or modern Spanish, and it's kind of a mixture, which is why there's all this people can talk about it. But I think the essential thing to say is that this is, for the most part, Old Spanish with some French influenced Spanish, Judeo-Spanish, and some modern Castilian Spanish, all mixed together. And that's sort of what this is. It's a little mixture of different things, and we'll see. This will become elucidated as we go along. So that's what I grew up with: this melody, this tune, this text, in this booklet, exactly printed as you see. Oops. So where did it come from? Our late great friend and relative of some of the people on this session here was Professor Herman Solomon. Professor Solomon was born in Amsterdam, was a professor of French and Portuguese, and an expert in all things linguistic in particular, but an expert in Spanish Portuguese liturgy and literature. And he wrote an article in 1969 called "The Strange Odyssey of Bendigamos," where he traces its history. And without getting too engrossed in all the details of things he says, including some of the corrections he makes to the language, he traces it back to France. And its first publications are both in France. The Spanish, which was first published in 1891 by a scholar named Kaiserling. And they produced the text here on the left, which we can look at a little closer later on. But that's the first time it gets published in an academic work about the literature of Spanish and Portuguese Jews. And it's sort of like appended at the end. The article is really a long list of Spanish and Portuguese books that were published in either Spanish or Portuguese, which was, this is the early kind of scholarship into this community, the Western Sephardim and their literature. And at the end, he says that he received a letter from a fellow named Molina, who was in Paris, with this Spanish song that is sung for the Grace After Meals. And then he reproduces it here. Bendigamos a el Altísimo, al Señor que nos crió, démosle agradecimiento por los bienes que nos dio. The first stanza is essentially the same as what we know when we just sang. It gets a little different as you go on. And that was published in 1891. And then Professor Solomon notes that there is a little more information given here, that that the text was transmitted by the president or the shamash of the administrator of the temple in Buffo, that's the Portuguese synagogue in Paris. That becomes significant later on. But also that there is a text of this known already earlier in French that was published by Monsieur Lévy Alvarez. And that is where Professor Solomon goes to examine. He discovers the original texts in an 1825 publication by this man, David Lévy Alvarez, who was from Bordeaux and who had a pretty important literary and pedagogical career, with a lot of publications. But one of his publications were poems, sacred poems, among which is this French poem, Bénissons, Bénissons. And in the first edition of this book in 1825, he writes that it's to the tune of Bendigamos. So he doesn't give you the text of Bendigamos, but he gives you his own French version, which he even says here, it's a little hard to see, imité de l'hébreu et l'espagnol, that it's his imitation or his in copying the style of the Spanish and the Hebrew of the original Bendigamos. And so that is the source. And so Professor Solomon traces its origins, the Bendigamos that we know, from Bordeaux of the early 19th century, 1825, to the Paris Portuguese Jews. And where it gets transmitted, he suspects, or he there's a little bit of a speculation by Professor Solomon that Mr. Maduro, Mr. Eli Levy Maduro, who transmitted this to Mr. Molina, who gave it to Kaiserling, and is being published in 1891, must have brought it from Paris to Curacao. Curacao is an interesting place, and the Maduro family has a long history in Curacao, but it's from Curacao that it gets transmitted to New York. But before we get to that story, the French version that was done by Mr. Alvarez is still sung in France and in Paris and in Bordeaux to this day. Maybe not the most common thing, but in those Portuguese synagogues, this poem is still sung, and it's been recorded in various forms. One of the nicest one is by a children's choir that was done in 2002 from this CD, which I highly recommend. I don't know if it's still being sold, but it's a really great album. And let's listen to it. Let me just. And so that song, which was published already in 1825, is still sung to the same melody as it was then to this day in Portuguese communities in France. And if you notice and paid attention and took a look at the translation, or if you know French, this is not Mercat Amazon, and it is not sung for Mercat Amazon. It is sung more as a hymn, a poem. I don't know all the special occasions that they sing it at, but essentially at special occasions, they sing this melody. Yeah. But it does have this refrain, Hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki le'olam chasto, which is the same as from our Bendigamos, and it has the same melody, and a few other things match, sort of the rhyme scheme matches, but also some of the themes, not a lot of them, match the Bendigamos as well. So that's Benusson. That's the French poem, what Herman Solomon identified and traced as the origin of our Bendigamos, and also found that it was originally Spanish, although he didn't find a Spanish version until that was published until 1891. Then the question becomes, how does it get to New York? Because New York is not a French or Spanish really speaking community. And so how did this come? And as I mentioned earlier, that has to do with Reverend Joseph Corcos. Nope, not that. Okay. Before we get to that, let's take a look at, or this is actually where we're heading. As Professor Solomon noted, that the person who transmitted the Spanish version to Kaiserling came through a man named Maduro, who was the administrator. I don't know if that's the shamash or the president. I don't know exactly what, or the executive director. I don't know who the administrator is, what title that is, of the synagogue in Paris, the Buffo, the Portuguese synagogue in Paris. But he is from Curacao. His family is a pretty prominent Curacao family, and so Professor Solomon speculates that it was he who transmitted it from Paris to Curacao, but that remains speculation. What we do know is that in Curacao, they are singing this song, Bendigamos, in the way that Kaiserling had published. And from the 19th century, don't know exactly how old, but certainly from the late 19th century until this day. And so in 1969, there is a recording from Curacao that you can go and listen to. It's available in the Hebrew University, the National Library website, which we're going to listen to now. It was done by a man named Abrahami. I don't know who he was, or if he still lives, I don't know. But it was done in 1969. And here is the text, which matches exactly to the text that Kaiserling published in 1891.
Bendigamos a el Altísimo, al Señor que nos creó. Démosle agradecimiento por los bienes que nos dio. Alabado sea su santo nombre, porque siempre nos apiadó. Odul Adonai Kitob, Kilen Olam Chasto. Bendigamos a el Altísimo por el pan primeramente y después por los manjares que comimos juntamente. Pues comimos y bebimos alegremente, su merced nunca nos faltó. Load al Señor que es bueno, que para siempre su merced. Bendita sea la casa esta, que nunca manque en ella fiesta, tarde, mañana y siesta, anuncia a los hijos de Israel.
And I don't know, it's really beautiful. I don't know who Mr. Abrahami was, but or is, but it's a really nice rendition, known in other forms. Actually, if there's a CD out, I'm dating myself by talking about CDs, but there's an album that was put out by the Hebrew University with Gideon Zellermeyer, who was a Chazan originally from Montreal. I don't know where he is now. Really great Chazan, where they re-recorded with a choir and with piano accompaniment the music of Curacao. And he has a version which I'm not going to play for you, which is also great, and because he has a great voice. But this one, just the way he pronounces everything and phrases everything, really sounds very authentic to me. And this is what's done in Curacao, was done in Curacao, and presumably still is to this day. And as you note in this text comes from really the main history of Curacao, which is written by a man named Emmanuel in the 1960s. And he has this note that he said, before saying grace after meals, the entire family would sing the following verses, now chanted only twice yearly in the Sukkah of the synagogue. I don't know his sources, if he knows it personally from the history while he was the Chazan, or he was the rabbi in Mikveh Israel Emmanuel in Curacao for a long time. I don't know if that's how he knows it or from other sources, but that's what he says. That originally was sung always for Birkat Hamazon and then became only for Sukkot. What's interesting is that we sing it here in New York for Sukkot primarily. If you are familiar with our version, you will note some major differences, some significant differences. One of those differences is that in stanza 3 here, you'll see Bendigamos el Altísimo por el pan primeramente. Firstly, for the bread. First, I have to give blessings to the Lord. Thank you for the bread. In our version, we say por su ley primeramente, for the law first of all, which means the Torah, and then only afterwards in another verse, which we'll see later, in the version we sing here in Shearith Israel, we have por el pan seguramente, secondarily for the bread. So that's a pretty significant difference. And then some of the other things are pretty close. Obviously, the language of the translation for the Hodu, Load al Señor que es bueno, que para siempre su merced, that is exactly the same between Curacao and New York. But that last stanza here, Bendita sea la casa esta, we have that. We have blessing should be on this house. But then it gets different. It says, que nunca manque en la fiesta, where there is never a lack of celebration. We have a little different version. Tarde mañana y siesta. We don't have that at all, which you could translate afternoon, morning, or afternoon or evenings, tomorrow, and at rest. But really, that means evening, morning, and in the afternoon, which is the 3 meals of Shabbat, by the way. Right? You have 3 meals on Shabbat. These are the 3 meals of Shabbat. For us and all the children of Israel. So that's a difference between Shearith Israel's version and the version sung in Curacao. But really, the main thing is that, or one of the main things is this por su ley primeramente, or is it por el pan primeramente? What comes first? We'll see a little later. So that is the one version in Curacao. Now let's get to Reverend Korkos. Reverend Korkos was born in Morocco. Here we go. Born in Morocco and trained to be a rabbi in Morocco. And then he goes to college. He becomes a musmach early on in his late teens. Then he goes to college in Spain at the Royal College of Salamanca. He graduates. And I remember once seeing, I forget if it was from Chacham Gaon or Herman Solomon or Rabbi Isaac Sassoon. So I forgot what somebody claimed to have been the first graduate since the Inquisition of higher education in Spain, but I think they're wrong because I think it was Korkos, who was a graduate of the Royal College of Salamanca. In like 1891 or 1892. Anyway, Korkos then goes to England, where he gets a smicha degree from Chacham Gaster, who's the rabbi of the Spanish Portuguese community in London. And the same year that he graduates or gets that smicha, he gets hired to be the minister, the Chazan, in Jamaica. and he's there for a few years, and then he goes to Curacao for a few years. He goes back to Jamaica, goes back to Curacao, and then he leaves the rabbinate. There's some hints that he had some difficulties in some of these places, um, and he says not going to be a chazan anymore. Goes into business and moves to New York, where, as we saw earlier, or we spoke about earlier, he gets pulled back into chazanut when there is no one else to be the chazan in 1919 at the end of World War One in New York. And so that is the story of Korkos. Now, as you'll see here, here is the version of Bendigamos that Korkos is attributed with. And let me just make this smaller. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. This is the version that Professor Solomon was using. You'll see it's translated into English for the Spanish-Portuguese Synagogue, West 70th Street by Joseph Korkos, acting minister, October 1921. So presumably he had been singing it and they liked it and said, come on, let us all sing it. And so he published it with a translation into English. The really great thing of this translation is that you can sing it. It's in the same meter and rhyme scheme. So it's oh, let us bless the Lord Most High, the God that we adore. Give thanks and bless his holy name and praise him evermore. The rhyme scheme will work, and you can sing through the whole thing if you wanted to in the same melody. Guide, abide, disgrace, race, tried, abide. I mean, you can go through the whole thing and see how it goes. It's not exactly a perfect literal translation, but it's pretty close, and it gives you the general sense of things. And what can I tell you about this? And this is essentially the same version that we sing. Not exactly, but pretty darn close to what we sing. And this is the version that Korkos brought from Curacao to New York, which then completes the picture that Professor Solomon published in his book, that it went from France to Curacao. Korkos brought it to New York, and then it becomes famous and goes all over the world from here. I'm going to pause before we go on and take a look at some of the Carla, who is Herman's niece, tells us that his Nachala will be this Sunday, which is pretty great. This is a very nice tribute to him as well. Thank you. Yes, so we mentioned that it doesn't say Por Soleil in the Curacao version. So Professor Solomon intuited that a lot of the changes from the original version that was published by Kaiserling in 1891, and which is known from Curacao to this day, but which differ from the New York version, were some kind of edit done by Reverend Korkos. That Korkos, for whatever reason, decided to change some of the language. And so he thought that Torah should be mentioned before talking about the food. So he added this por sule primeramente and other changes as well. As you'll see, bendita sea la casa esta, el hogar de su presencia, donde guardarmos su fiesta con alegría y permanencia. So it's a little different than the version that we saw before, where we have here, where feasts and blessings never will fail. So it's a little different than the morning, afternoon, and evening song, part of the Curacao version. Why he did so, don't know. Whether he even did so, don't know. But that was Professor Solomon's speculation, and it's probably correct. And that Korkos is the one who introduces the version here that we're seeing, and it's not known beforehand, these things. One of the things that Professor Solomon really disliked in the version that we sing here in New York is this line, que liga a nuestra raza, his chosen people's race. Oh, bless the Lord, whose gracious hand has saved from all disgrace. That's and led in his glorious mission here, his chosen people's race. Oh, praise and magnify his name. That's the Hodu part. So he doesn't actually even translate the por sule primeramente, which is his own edition, or at least the edition that doesn't exist in Curacao. directly. He says that's the mission. That's the mission, is the Torah, blessing the God for the Torah. But he says, his chosen people's race. So Professor Solomon said the term Raza is a pejorative, that it was only used to denigrate Jews in medieval Spanish, and that Jews, the original Spanish of the early modern period, Jews would not say that they were, God's chosen Raza. So he didn't like that word, but also thought that it was telling that it was modern and not old, and therefore probably written by Korkos. Okay, hope that made sense. Moving right along. So here is Rabbi Joseph Korkos, and I like that they call him Rabbi. This is a text from 1925 from a book of all the Jewish community of Montreal. It sort of goes through all of the different rabbis, the history of the community of Montreal, Ashkenazic, Sephardic, and has a lot of biographical information about important people in Montreal Jewish history. And it was published in the end of 1925, and has this biography of Reverend Korkos, which I want to read to you because A, it's interesting, but also because it mentions Bendigamos. Rabbi Joseph Korkos, Montreal. Author, historian, and poet Rabbi Korkos of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue Sheretz Israel in Montreal was born at Mogador, Morocco, December 21st, 1872, the son of Moses and Julia Rodriguez Brandon Korkos. He is a grandson of the late Dr. Abraham Korkos, who was for many years Dayan of the Spanish-Portuguese Jews in England. Joseph Korkos received his Hebrew and Talmudical education in Mogador, Morocco, where he studied under the famous rabbis Judah ben Muyab, Joseph Benatar, and Rabbi M. Cohen, from whom he received his rabbinical degree. He is also a graduate of the Royal College of Salamanca, Spain. In 1893, he received his rabbinical diploma in England from Reverend Dr. Moses Gaster, chief rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese of England, and the same year he was elected minister of the congregation in Kingston, Jamaica, where he remained until 1903. He then became the rabbi of the Jewish community of Curacao so that's a little bit actually of he goes back and forth between Curacao and Jamaica several times. It's a little bit of a contraction here. From 1918 to 1922, he was connected with the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York, and in 1922 was unanimously elected to the present community in Montreal. Rabbi Korkos has been recognized as one of the greatest living chazans of the Spanish-Portuguese Jews. As a writer, he is known by his works The Spanish Inquisition, The Jews of Curacao, and Auto de Fe in Mexico. I haven't seen all of these books, but his synopsis of the history of the Jews of Curacao is quite famous because it was the first history of the Jews of Curacao. And he translated the Dinim of Shchita and Bidika into English. I don't know where that was ever published. And included among his poems is Kol Yosef. I don't know what that is. I don't know. His Bendigamos has been introduced into almost every Spanish and Portuguese congregation in the world. That is an interesting statement. He's the author of a film called The Birth of America, in which he shows the part that Jews played in the development of the nation. Rabbi Korkos is married to Angelita, daughter of Sidney Cohen Enriquez of Kingston, Jamaica. He has 3 sons and 4 daughters. Before we move away from Reverend Korkos, is he bareheaded in the picture? Almost assuredly. Almost assuredly. Although I have to say his hair looks a little bit pasted down, so I don't know. Okay. Reverend Korkos, just before you, just a few side things that are not related to the story of Bendigamos, but just interesting things. Reverend Korkos was married twice. His first wife died, and he married his second wife, Angelita, who is the daughter of Sidney Cohen Enriquez, who actually was living in New York. He married her in New York, even though they're a Jamaican family. Her Hebrew name, and I kid you not, and you cannot make this up, Angelita, his second wife's Hebrew name, was Vashti. Not a very common name today. But we recite her Hashkabah in the perpetual Hashkabot, and it always strikes me very interesting. Vashti, pretty great name. what else can I tell you? One of his daughters, he had several children, as you see. One of his daughters was also became a famous artist. Maybe we'll talk about her another day in another class. Um, pretty well-known artist in New York City, but we'll leave that for another time. Okay, so you can see here in 1935, while Quercus is still alive, it is said that his Bendigamos has been introduced into almost every Spanish-Portuguese congregation in the world. That is an interesting statement. Because it implies that he composed Bendigamos. And so this is the first indication, we'll see others, that Quercus was in fact, the author of the version that is sung in New York. And already by 1925, that version was being sung elsewhere, presumably in Jamaica, in Montreal, and perhaps elsewhere, even into Amsterdam. Now, let's move on from here. In 2012, if you're still with me, just trying to bring back the video panel. Nope, not that. Here we go. In 2012, a follow-up article was published by a very prominent ethnomusicologist in Israel named Edwin Seroussi. Seroussi has been working with Spanish-Portuguese sources and other Sephardic sources for a long, long time. And he grew enamored of Bendigamos. And he did a follow-up article to Herman's article, which was in 1969. This article came out in 2012, where he entitled it The Odyssey of Bendigamos, Stranger Than Ever. And it's a long article. I'm only going to show you the highlights. The highlights are that he found earlier sources than the French 1825 version by Alvarez in Bordeaux of Bendigamos in manuscripts that come from Livorno in the late 18th century. So he brings it back another half a century, from 1825 to the 1770s or so, where you have Bendigamos al Altissimo in two manuscripts that come from Livorno. And you can actually get them online through the Ketiv website, through the National Library. I gave you them right here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on their text, just briefly. So what Seroussi does is he analyzes the text that was published by Kaiserling in 1891, that we already heard from Curacao, with these versions from Livorno. And he puts them in a nice chart here. He transliterates it, and I gave you the original version from Kaiserling. And he notes that the first two verses or stanzas are almost exactly the same. Por el pan primeramente, remember that? But then they go different in the last two. This is about Moses and Mount Sinai, and not about food, morning, evening, and afternoon, or evening, morning, and afternoon. It diverges in the end part of the poem, but clearly it starts off Bendigamos altissimo. This is the source text, or this is an earlier version of Bendigamos. Doesn't have a melody associated with it, but this is presumably the same melody as was done in France, which was already known to be this Az Yashir melody. And Seroussi later on shows that a lot of the text, he does others, which I'll show now. The other thing he does is he analyzes Ladino songs, Judeo-Spanish, really Hecatara, the Judeo-Spanish of Morocco, essentially, from songs that are not Bendigamos, really, not Bendigamos at all, but which contain some of the same lines, like this one. This is just one example of several that he finds. Comimos juntamente, pues comimos juntamente, and el pan primeramente. He finds these lines that are in Bendigamos in other Judeo-Spanish songs from Morocco. And then essentially his thesis is that the Spanish song Bendigamos that we know, as Professor Solomon posited, came to New York from Curacao, came to Curacao from Bordeaux, came to Bordeaux from Livorno, and was a mishmash of various texts to create this version of the Birkat Hamazon in Spanish. That's the essential idea. Now let's go back. This is the version that Professor Solomon was published in his article, and this is the one that he speculated from, that Korkos was the author of the version we sing in New York. We saw that it was almost explicitly attributed to him in a biography of 1925 from Montreal. But one of the things that I found interesting that Professor Solomon didn't publish, probably because he didn't know it, is the original version of this. This is a reprint. You wouldn't know that this is a reprint. It looks like it's the original. It says October 1921 on it, but this actually is a reprint. And how do I know that? Because in the archives of Shearith Israel is an entire folder from the papers of David de Solapool about his efforts to correct the mistakes in Korkos's version. And the original version of Bendigamos that was printed in October 1921 was this: composed and translated into English for the Spanish Portuguese Jews by Joseph Korkos, acting minister, October 1921. Composed and translated into English by Reverend Joseph Korkos. So here, Korkos is taking credit for this version. It is not the same as the one sung in Curacao, and he explicitly says that he's the one who wrote this version. It's composed by him. So you don't have to speculate, but it's pretty amazing that Professor Solomon was able to do so, just from the language of it itself. But here it is written very explicitly that Korkos was the one who wrote this version. What there isn't in the archives of Shearith Israel are any notes of Korkos. Korkos didn't leave any record of why he chose the language he chose, what he was attempting to do, or when he did it. Did he do it while he was still in Curacao? Did he do it when he was in Jamaica? Did he do it when he was in New York? Don't know. No, all we know is this: that they must have started singing it. People liked it. They asked him to publish it, and this is what he produced. Why isn't it sung in English at Shearith Israel? I think that's actually an interesting question. I think it doesn't feel authentic. We don't sing really anything in English here at Shearith Israel. I can't think of any English songs that we sing. Maybe I'm wrong, but my mother or Carla will tell me if there was, or Annette, any songs that are sung in English. But okay. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. Perhaps they did. Perhaps they, in the 1921, perhaps in the Sukkah, they sang it in this version. Don't know. But you could, if you wanted to, sing it in this meter. So let's see what else we can discover from the Shearith Israel archives. And I know it's already pretty late. We'll try to go a little faster. So here we have the version that was published. Actually, it says October 1921, but we'll see this was actually done a little later. This was the original in October 1921, and this is a version that was published around 1925, 1926, with corrections made by Dr. Poole. And now we have to go. Remember, it was published in October 1921. In 1922, Dr. Poole comes back from Israel to become the minister at Shearith Israel, and Korkos goes to Montreal. Here is a letter in September 1923, written by Dr. Poole to Zarita Nahon. Dear Miss Nahon, we need to reprint our Bendigamos, but I am not anxious to reprint its misprints, nor to reprint its peculiarities of style. May I therefore ask you to be good enough to revise the text, making such alterations as are essential. Your task is perhaps not an easy one, as you first have to decide whether the language is going to be Castilian or Ladino. Is it going to be written in Spanish or in Ladino? In any case, the spelling should be Castilian. The ellipses of the last line of each verse might be avoided. Such overloaded lines as the 5th verse of verse 3 are unsingable. With appreciation, that's Dr. Poole. So let's just take a look what he says. The ellipses should be avoided, and the overloaded line of the 5th verse, the 5th line of verse 3 are unsingable. So let's see what that one is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pues comimos y bebimos alegremente. That one Poole did not like, and he wanted someone to change it. That is one of the things that he says. He also thinks that the version that Corco said was had grammatical mistakes, and he wanted to correct those, as well as some of the peculiarities of style. So he contacts this woman, Miss Nahon. If you are a Ladino, if you are a Ladino scholar, you might recognize the name Zarita Nahon, who published a book later on, not in the 1920s, I think in the 30s or 40s, of Spanish, Judeo-Spanish songs from Morocco. She was from Tangier, and the northern part of Morocco, and was an expert in the Judeo-Spanish language of Morocco. And I think she was a member here at Cherith Israel, and Dr. Poole leaned on her expertise to edit and correct Bendigamos so that he can reprint it. Just to give you a note, that's 1923. So 2 years after it was printed, they needed to reprint it again. So the reasons for that are not stated explicitly, but I think you can imagine. Let's say, I don't know how many copies they printed. Let's say they printed 200 copies. Don't know. Maybe they printed 500 copies. I don't know how many they printed, but they printed of that original set X number. But people liked it, so they took them with them. And now, 2 years later, they don't have them anymore in the synagogue to give out on Sukkot, and they need to reprint them. And so this is what he's going to Miss Nahon for. So she writes back. It's a little bit hard to see. There's some back and forth that I haven't given you between the early part of 1924. But in May 1924, she writes to Dr. Poole, your note, she didn't get it. I'm sorry, I was not successful with the Bendigamos. No one knew nothing about it. She tried to reach people in Morocco who knew this song so she could get the original language. Said one person that she contacted knew nothing about it. The other remembered it vaguely, but would ask his friend and let me know the result. Meaning she didn't know the language. She thought it comes from Morocco. Corco's came from Morocco. It said that he wrote it. Let me ask the people in Morocco. She's not successful in figuring out what the original version is. That's the essence of what she writes. And then she says to call her brother Mr. Toledano. And this is a letter that comes a little later from Poole, also to this woman, Miss Nahon. At your suggestion, I'm writing to your brother-in-law, Mr. Toledano, asking him for his minimum revision of the much worried Bendigamos. Eventually, after so much talent has been spent on it, we may be so embarrassed by the excellence and the number of suggestions, meaning they're all Toledano and Poole himself and Miss Nahon are making corrections to Corcos's text. And he says, we're going to be so embarrassed by the number of changes we're making that in despair we may reprint it with just a few typographical corrections. If only we knew the language it's supposed to be written in. He's really trying to figure out what it should be. I'm sorry that your international correspondence in search of the original folk words has not resulted in the discovery of something manifestly of the 15th century, meaning it doesn't come from Spain. Sorry that you can't find it from that period. And then he goes on. So I'm hoping I'm leading you to the fact that other versions of this exist and existed already in the times of Poole, not from Serusi, but that Poole was afraid to change the text that Korkos had written. And now he has another one. This is November 1923. You have undertaken a ticklish job, and if I may most humbly be permitted to judge, have succeeded very gracefully. We'll see the version she wrote later. Whether or not you have improved the rhythm and the phrasing more than the Ladino advocates will approve of, I cannot say. Meaning, if she's writing, will the Ladino speakers like it? Personally, I find your version more easily singable. But is not the refrain with such words as altissimo, which you have avoided, so much part and parcel of the tradition that it ought to be preserved? Meaning she radically changed the version that Korkos had done and took out even the word altissimo, which is in the first line of the song. Even though it may shock your fine Castilian sense. I do not know, but I fear that a bitter warfare may be waged about my innocent head if I recommend too many of what might otherwise be necessitated changes in the text. So he's writing her in a very nice way. I love your version. I can't use it. It's too different than Korkos's version. They're not going to let me publish it here. They're going to, there's going to be a controversy if I try to publish your version. But he says it in a really nice way. And now we have correspondence with her brother-in-law, Mr. Toledano, who I have not researched. I think he was also a scholar of Moroccan Judeo-Spanish, but I don't know him. But I can tell you that he lived in New York in the 1920s. And here is the letter. At the suggestion of Miss Zarita Nahon, I am sending you the enclosed text of the Bendigamos, which we sing after the meals, with the request that you be good enough to correct the text in as far as it needs revision. There are manifest errors of spelling. As I understand it, the text is not supposed to be Castilian Spanish, but rather a Ladino text. We would therefore like to have as few changes made as are absolutely necessitated, as otherwise it would be necessary practically to rewrite the whole poem. He already knows from Zarita that when she wrote it to Spanish, it took too many changes. I do not seem to be able to find anyone who has a living tradition of this poem, except insofar as the first verse is concerned. So he knows already that Bendigamos is sung in Curacao, and the first verse matches. Everything else doesn't match, to greater or lesser degree. And he's saying, I only know that in Curacao they sing the first verse. Everything else seems different. And then he says, I have a suspicion that Mr. Korkos has filled in the latter verses with his pen rather than his memory. So Poole is not saying that Korkos authored it, even though that's clearly what is the case, but he puts it in a kind of nice way. He must have filled in things that he didn't remember, either from Morocco or from Curacao, that weren't in the original. And then he asks. So Toledano writes back. I return here with a copy of Bendigamos in which I have confined myself to correcting the misspelt words, although the text would need to be altered in many places to conform to prosodic rules which are largely disregarded. He doesn't like the prosody. He doesn't like the way that the melody matches the words, and he would have to change it too much, but he avoided doing those edits and just did the spelling. And he says that he's not impressed with it. The third stand is especially poor. You could read through if you want, or I could send you a copy if you're interested in what Toledano thinks of Korkos's version. So what happens? September 1924. So it's a year later from when he started this thing, and he writes to Mr. Mencken, the president of the congregation at that time. Dear Mr. Mencken, after considerable investigation, I have obtained a satisfactory corrected version. That's the one that Toledano did with it. He basically just corrects the spelling, essentially. With some other minor changes of the Bendigamos, which it was decided last year to reprint for use in the Sukkah. Then he gives a couple of options. How many do you want me to print? 1,000, 500? That's the question. let me know. The next month, October 16th, I don't get the response, but clearly it wasn't a good one, because here is Poole's letter to the clerk of the congregation, not to the president, which I find interesting. Dear Mr. Cohen, it is a pity that the Bendigamos was reprinted this summer from the old text. They didn't wait for Dr. Poole to come back with the new version. They used the old text. As the board will see from the enclosed, there are, in reprinted Spanish text alone, 21 elementary misspellings and about 24 other clerical errors. He can't, Poole is so upset, he's livid, that they went ahead and printed it just as it was without consulting him, without waiting for his updated version. I took my commission seriously and made inquiries both in New York City and Morocco, Gibraltar, Central America to obtain a corrected text. It was my desire, and I believed also the desire of the trustees, to reprint the Bendigamos free from misspellings and other clerical errors. But alas. Okay. So that was 1924. So that, if you're keeping track, let's see if I no. That was this version. They just, when they reprinted it in 1924, they wrote translated into English, Corcos, exact same text. They took out the word that that he was the author of it. Why, I'm not sure. And printed it exactly as it was, including the words October 1921 on it, even though this was the original version from October 1921. That's the one that Poole is upset about. Then Poole later on prints another one with some minor changes. Grace after meat, that's pretty bad error. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that's a mistake. Okay. One other thing. So he continues after that 1924 reprint. He knows that they're going to need to reprint it again, and he's upset at what they did. So he continues his and he's interested in Bendigamos. So he writes to another scholar named Blundheim with certain questions. I'm perplexed about a few points. Here, enclosed is a reprint, which we are about to do. This is 1926, with a song we sing in the Sukkah. I am perplexed with one or two points. Should the spelling agree with modern Castilian Spanish? Meaning he has to make some editorial choices, and he's asking another scholar of Spanish and French what he would do. This fellow's name is Blundheim. Should we use accents as in modern Spanish? Should we keep the spelling comimos and bebimos, which is found in all the versions I've collected, or should it be comemos and bebemos? Small minor changes that would reflect either modern or archaic Spanish. And then he has, should we use the word manjares or condumios? Should it be delights, this strange word, or should it be more, condiments, that is more modern Spanish? And then he gets a response in French, which I'm not going to bother with. And then he responds back in 1926. Dear Dr. Blundheim, very many thanks for your illuminating letter. I certainly did not wish to go to any trouble in connection with the text of Bendigamos. You have, however, shaken me in that the one point which I felt positive that there was a need for correction, namely eliminating the double S in altissimo, was doubtful of almost everything else. The she'elah is indeed trefa. It's a nice little idiom that he puts in there. That what he thought he knew, he didn't know. Blundheim is a much bigger scholar than Poole is, and regarding Spanish and medieval Spanish, and he says to keep altissimo the way it was. But so what happens? These are the versions that Poole collected. This is the handwritten corrections. He wants to change altissimo. Doesn't like demos le agradecimiento. He doesn't like the word y también por los manjares. He wants to change the language there. He wants to change comimos and bebimos, as we saw. And so he has these handwritten on the one from Quarkos. He also has the version that Toledano sent him, which is over here, and that Nahon sent him, which is over here, which is much more aggressive. This is a more minor changes. These are major changes. Both of them are significantly different than the original. And then there's also a version here. This comes from a Gibraltarian version, which is Bendigamos Altissimo al Señor que nos crió. And you'll see this is from Gibraltar. This is something that he had received in the 1924 correspondence. And I just want to show you here that it says Los Angeles de Admiración. This is I don't know the Spanish well enough, and I probably didn't prepare the language closely enough. But this is a version that, or very closely matches one of the versions that was noted by Edwin Seroussi. So already in the 1920s, those Northern Moroccan versions, which Seroussi in 2012 discovers, were considered by Poole when he was trying to reprint it in 1924. But Poole writes, what Seroussi doesn't write, is that the Gibraltarian version with these last stanzas seems to be for Shavuot. And if you go back and look at the Livorno versions, where it's talking about the Torah being given on Mount Sinai and the adoration of Moses, it certainly does seem to be something for Shavuot. And whether that reflects an actual liturgical practice that they sang that version on Shavuot, or whether it reflects the original texts coming from Judeo-Spanish songs about Moses, I don't know. We'll have to leave that for Professor Seroussi. And that is the story. And that leaves us with what we have today. And the only changes that Poole ends up making in his final version are super minor. They're spelling changes. He decides to make it with one S, and he puts in diacritical marks as in modern Castilian Spanish, and not the way it was originally that Corcos had. And tiny changes, nothing significant, because by the time he's reprinting it in 1924, 1926, he considers the version that Corcos introduced to be the one we sing. He didn't want to fight with the congregation. The congregation knew this version, and even though he didn't like it, and he thought it should be improved or could be improved, this was the received tradition from Corcos. And so that is the story of Bendigamos.
Bendigamos al Altísimo, al Señor que nos crió. Démosle agradecimiento por los bienes que nos dio. Alabado sea su santo nombre, porque siempre nos ha apiadó. Lo alaba, Señor, que es bueno, que para siempre su merced.
So that's the story. I'm going to stop my share and also allow everyone to comment. I don't know how much of the story you knew. A lot of you, I think, knew the Strange Odyssey of Bendigamos that Professor Solomon published. Probably somewhat fewer of you knew Edwin Seroussi's update, and probably none of you knew that Poole already in the 1920s was trying to update it and found some of the versions, or very similar versions, to what was found by Seroussi in 2012 already in the 1920s, but didn't publish them because the Board of Trustees already did it without him. And that's the story of Bendigamos. Hope you enjoyed. Take care, everybody. What do you sing in Albert? What do you sing in when do you sing Bendigamos in Philadelphia? Every Shabbat? Only special holidays? Here, let me can you I have to make you all ask all. There we go.
All right. Very good. First, thank you very much, Hazar Baruch. Beautiful, beautiful presentation. Yeah, we sing it when I came to Philadelphia. It was sang very erratically, and then I introduced it every Shabbat after every meal. Sometimes when we are in a rush, I took the last two stanzas. Bendita sea la casa esta. So that's shorter, So if people cannot stay too long after Birkat Hamazon.
By the way, one of the things I don't know if it was clear to everybody, but the version we sing says "Bendita sea la casa esta el hogar de su presencia, donde guardamos su fiesta," making it about on this festive occasion, which I always associated with the fact that we sing it on Sukkot.
That's right.
Oh, the original Curacao one, it talks about, evening, morning, and afternoon, which makes it much more general, not
That's
just
right.
for Sukkot.
That's why in New York, during my time, it was sang only on Sukkot. You remember with the pamphlet, the piece of paper? Yeah. A few things I want to mention. Administrator in the synagogue, the Portuguese synagogue in Paris, means a board of a member of the board. You're wondering what
it
was.
The administrator means member of the board. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, a member of the board. Okay.
Thank you.
And
Shamash. I was hoping,
yeah.
maybe Shamash can get to be a member of the board one day.
And also, the song of Bendigamos he sang also in Paris. He go in Rue Beaufort, and he sang. I just heard it last year in Mina Metzar Karatia. Mina Metzar Karatia. Anani B'Merhabia. We do that also sometime in Philadelphia. And if you want about Dr. Serusi, if anybody is interested, he's in Philadelphia for 1 year. He's at the Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, and he came to our synagogue
great.
on Sukkot.
Also, maybe you'll tell him that if he wants to write an even stranger Odyssey, he should come to the archives and take a look at what Pulu has about Bendigamos.
That's true. So yes, until I think June or May or whatever it is, the annual.
Very nice. Thank you.
And for the person who asked how come Korkos didn't wear a kippah, in the 1920s and 30s, no minister wore a kippah at all. It was not a custom. It became later on a custom for people to wear a kippah.
I can show you many pictures of Dr. Mendes, Dr. Poole.
No, nobody wears a kippah. Yes. People are very strange because they look at the modern times, recent time, yeah. One more thing I want to add also that I heard, and I hope it's true. I heard that Korkos was there, and all the other Chazanim could not make it. And you heard that story, right?
This is the story is about him. The famous story is about him. So tell it. They don't know it. Tell
okay. There was nobody around, and so it was only Reverend Korkos who's going to say Kippur. The whole Kippur service by himself. He said to the board, "But I may faint." And they said, "It's a risk you are willing to take."
Yeah, the way I heard it's told is that he said to Captain N. Taylor Phillips, who was the president of the congregation at the time, "If I have to read the whole Kippur service from beginning to end, I'm going to die." And they said, "That's a risk we'll have to take."
Imagine how he felt at that time. Yeah.
Thank you all for tuning in, and I think it's a very
nice, the French version.
I'm sorry.
The French version, every stanza it finishes up.
Well, that's their melody is a slightly different melody.
Yeah,
in Amsterdam, the Baruch Haba melody that they sing is like one. I don't know how that. Let's see. Right, it's like there's the version we sing in New York. Baruch haba b'shem Adonai berachnuchem mibeit Adonai el Adonai vaya'er lanu. So we have that finishing. In Amsterdam, they go el Adonai vaya'er lanu. It's a harmony where one chazan kept it one way and one chazan brought it to New York a different way, and really they go together. And I think the same thing can be said with da 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 da. I think if you could put them all together and you get a nice harmony.
Beautiful.
Okay, everybody.
Baruch, beautiful. Excellent.